So with this drawing challenge, we are making things a little more complicated, and we're taking on another issue. And that's the idea of changing the way we handle our materials to respond to the physical character of the objects that we're drawing. So far we've drawn only opaque objects. So they were all equal density, so our handling of them, our handling of the materials reporting their existence, representing them, could be the same. But in this case, we have a little bit different challenge in that some of these objects are stolidly opaque and others are translucent. And as a result, we've got to change the way we handle our materials to be able to respond to their ontic presentation, the presentation of their physical being, their differences in opacity and translucency. We're going to add some new materials this week as well. You'll notice we're going to be working with charcoal, but we're going to add to our charcoal a white Conte crayon. You will find the white Conte crayon in this little box, this little matchbox set that's included in your kit. And of course we'll add the estamp as well, and we'll have a kneaded eraser as we've done so far. The other difference that we're going to have this week is we're going to be working on a tinted ground. Now this gives us, with the addition of the white chalk, an expanded range of values. The white chalk gives us an augmented distance from very light to very dark, and the tinted paper gives us an already existing middle ground, middle value, which we're going to use in this drawing. It also gives us warm and cool. There are two sheets of paper in your kit, one warm, one cool. You're going to do a drawing on each. I just took the full sheet of paper and used my pad as a template to cut this down to this size. And today I'm going to work on the cool ground. I want you to try both the warm and the cool. The drawing we're going to do today could take two directions. One direction is to use the estamp to physically mix, like pigment or pastel, the white chalk and the charcoal together to get a range of grays. That's what we're not going to do today. We're actually going to use the bare paper, or just slightly veiled with either charcoal or white chalk, white Conte, barely veiled surface on the white paper to hold large areas of the drawing. Because when you look at the setup, you'll notice that there are areas, especially in the translucent objects, where just the barest veil of charcoal or white Conte crayon will report that surface appearance quite accurately. We're changing our handling of the materials, and we're using the materials to help, not as an obstruction, but rather as an assistance to representation. Now, we've talked so far about using form conceptions, and the reason why we drew those basic volumes was that so when we were approached more difficult objects, we could break them down into component shapes. You can see that's clearly in evidence today. An object like this complex object here or here or here is in part a cylinder. It's also in part the shoulders an oval. So you see we can apply what we learned from these form conceptions as components of these compound shapes. We also see in some instances a little bit of the sensibility of the cone as well, and we understand how, when light travels across this, how it behaves. So it makes drawing objects like this much simpler. This object in the background over here is rather cubic, and as such our understanding of drawing this volume helps us to understand this more complex volume. And you can see how this is part rectangle and part cone. So we break these complex shapes down into their simpler components, and it makes finding the value range much easier. The other problem we have today is all of these ellipses that, depending on their height, open to a different degree. We're going to want to get those correct and in alignment with their bases, so they seem to both sit in space and also seem to sit on the table surface. So let's start drawing. As has been our procedure, We're going to think about this setup as a collective, as if it were wrapped in an envelope. To start my drawing today, I placed a haze of air and atmosphere over the tinted piece of paper because we're going to work first subtractively by lifting out our shapes with our kneaded eraser. I don't want this too dark. What I basically am aiming for is to match the shadow pool that sits back here. And if this is too dark, then it becomes arduous to erase it. And if it's too pale, you don't get enough contrast for it to operate. Now what I like to do at this stage is, I'll take my chamois, you could take a tissue. I like to just soften this a bit. There we go. Again, don't lean too hard because we're going to erase this out and we don't want to be trying to dig coal here. Now, with that done, what many of you are going to be tempted to do is to take your kneaded eraser, give it a good chip, okay, and form it into a fine point and start drawing lines around things, which is exactly what we tried not to do so far. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the proverbial blunt instrument. I'm going to round this out, get a little bit sticky, and I'm going to pull out my objects as volumes. And again, I'm going to be conscious of what's to the right, what's to the left, where's my lowest point, where's my highest point, as collective volumes. Not drawing a line around them, but pulling out and moving from object to object rather quickly. And pulling out broad areas of light and dark. So my placement becomes a placement of form as kind of negative silhouettes or erased silhouettes, and a collective. I'm thinking of them first as a group. And then as the drawing goes forward, I'll break them back into component parts, and then if the drawing is successful in the end, I'll bring them all back together. And this allows me to work really quickly. If I'm not happy with it, all I have to do is wipe out and start again. And in fact, I can even start to some degree to describe cast shadows simply by erasing back to my original surface, and that gives me right away the distinction between table surface and background, and my cast shadows help me to locate these objects on the table surface. And again, you can go about this in a little more circumspect manner. I'm working rather swiftly so as not to presume upon your attention. Reflected light there. See, again, I'm not fussing over details too much. And as soon as you feel you have found as much as you can find, and this can be a very nuanced stage. I'm doing this very rapidly in big, broad excisions. This could be a little more subtle with the fullness of time. But once you've decided that you've gained all the information that you can from this stage, then you can add your charcoal and begin to work in the opposite direction, as we traditionally or usually do. Now, one of the elegances of this is that what this allows me to do now, as we did in the last drawing, is to find these objects by finding the shape around them. That also helps me to place a credible ambient value in the background. And of course I'm seeing all of these values relative to that ambient value. And I would check, for instance, this distance here very carefully, because it's going to locate, this negative shape will locate all three of these rather crucial and central objects for me. This one's just a little taller than that one. And I can begin to refine their shapes at this stage. Now, after I've got this cast shadow, so tentatively placed and I'm a little bit comfortable with it, I can begin to go inside the objects. Find this negative space here. And now I can even begin to find my cast shadows that knit these objects together and help me to measure the spaces between them. I don't want this pushed up too high in the frame, so I'm going to move this down a little bit and move this down a little bit. And it's better to catch this now than after you've really invested a lot of energy into articulating these objects. See, my first concern again, I disunified, pulled things into fragments. Now I kind of marry them back together. And in the next stage, I'll fragment them again. And it's this conversation back and forth between fragmentation and unity that composes the different stages of the drawing. See, I'm going to be very careful now about the space between these two objects and the shoulder of this object. And I can, at this stage, if I need to think a bit, take a stomp, just homogenize this value a bit. Or you might not do this at all. You might like just the raw texture of the charcoal on the paper, and that's perfectly acceptable. It's really something you have to decide for yourself. There are even moments where I can use the stomp to kind of merge a shadow with the object adjacent to it to get a shadow pool. Now I'm going to jump to the next phase. I might spend a bit of time at this phase just starting to refine and describe these objects. Draw this object, for instance, by the value that's behind it. But let's jump to one of the difficulties of this, and that's these ellipses that describe the tops, the openings of these objects. I mentioned last week that you can set them inside a rectangle if that helps to locate them in space. In fact, going back to our form conceptions, if you're having trouble measuring these objects, you could actually imagine them inside a box and then put a cylinder inside that box, and all of a sudden measuring them is not nearly so difficult. And these construction lines will, of course, disappear as you go forward in the drawing. So, let's refine some of these openings. I'm going to just pull them out as negative shapes, and then I will find their definition going forward.